I'm John Atack, and this is the illustrious Mark Laxer, author, raconteur, and currently a filmmaker, headed towards that, which is going to be great, I think. And Mark has brought up the topic of certainty, why some people have too much of it, some people don't have enough of it, some people want it, and some people would like to be rid of it. And let me start with the idea that comes from William James, which I think is vitally important and essential, and I've talked about often, and that is what he called noesis. And that is the feeling of knowing, being sure, being certain. And the example I always give, and anybody who's been watching here for too long will know this, is when I was 17 years old, a born-again Christian spent 2 years, when I was 17 years old, a born-again Christian spent 2 hours trying to convince me that I needed to let Jesus into my life. And he got a little bit confused when I started quoting scripture back at him, because I don't think that's permitted. And he backed away from me after 2 hours. He gave up. And as he backed away, fearful that I would leap on his back, I'm sure if he didn't, keep watching me carefully, he said, "I don't understand the Bible, but I know it's all true." And that is noesis. That's the feeling of certainty, and it drives us. And learning to separate that which we know based upon evidence from that which we know because we'd like it to be true is a very important part of growing up and not being a child anymore. And I fear that the majority of us never make it, that we cling on to our certainties, Donald Trump's or Joe Biden's, or whatever it is that makes us feel that the world is going the way it should go. So there's my opening gambit. Your move.
No, good. Thank you for the King's Gambit there. So here's a question. So do you feel that the lack of certainty is, or the drive for certainty, is that based on anxiety? So in other words, is there maybe a genetic component for some people? I guess the way you just framed it with your intro, John, was it's a behavioral issue. It's sort of like some people grow up, some people don't grow up. And I'm questioning that. That may well be the case, but this is just something I'm grappling with. I'm writing a novel about this very topic, certainty versus non-certainty. And of course, it's more of an adventure story, but that's sort of the psychological underpinnings of the novel. And I'm just wondering if the need for certainty is driven by some biological anxiety-based component. So if you're not, for example, if you're not absolutely certain about who we are and our creation, you're going to be going through life in a very anxious sort of way. In a very, sort of ongoing anxiety would be plaguing you. And therefore people, I'm not sure if it's the right way to characterize them as growing up or not growing up, although certainly for some people, I think that probably does make sense. But I'm thinking about billions of people. Like this seems like a species-wide issue. And I'm just wondering if some people have a genetic component where they don't feel anxious when they don't know, call them the agnostics. It's like asked Charles Darwin about, the actual creation, and Charles Darwin would have said, I don't know. And it's sort of like asking a Jew about the afterlife. Now, of course, there are many Jewish sects that don't go along with what I'm saying, but overall, the Jews are not big on the afterlife for a very simple reason, John, and that is, I don't know. So we don't focus on it. We focus on other things because we don't know. And for some reason, I don't know, the Jews, there you go, I don't know. The Jews seem to be okay with not knowing. Is that a genetic issue?
Let me just recapitulate what I was seeking to say. I think that maturity comes when you can distinguish material that is based on evidence, that is provable, that is palpable, tangible, whatever, from material based on supposition. So certainty that about something that you can't prove, like the existence of God, for example, or the idea that Donald Trump is a patriot. If you're putting forward arguments, that aren't evidence-based, that are based upon your emotions, that are based on your need for something to be true, then for me that is an aspect of childhood and adolescence. Adulthood is the point where you can, I think, say, I don't know these things, and possibly, that can evolve into I don't need to know these things, which is very much the place that I've arrived at age 67. That I'm happy, I'm content, I'm satisfied. So that's the first part of it. Just to clarify what I'm thinking there, it's not a matter of whether you're certain or not being, a mark of adulthood. It's if we interject belief where should be science, and that leads us off into other questions, which I think Stephen Jay Gould answered very well by saying that science and spirituality are separate magisteria, and in the field of science we can have a certainty largely by discovering natural law, but in the area of our consciousness and the nature of consciousness, for example, the hard problem of consciousness, as it's called by philosophers, we don't know, and we can't devise certainty for that. And so that's where agnosticism comes in, and the desire to understand, the desire to think things through. To return to your question, yeah, I'm sure that there's a physiological basis for anxiety. Obviously, we know about cortisol, the hormone that makes people feel more anxious and not. It's also one of the chemicals that wakes you up in the morning, so you can't get rid of it. We have interesting ideas. For example, if in the third trimester, the last trimester of pregnancy, a woman has a very high cortisol level, it is likely that the child will be born with a high cortisol level. I have anecdotal experience of this. So that's going to be a determinant. And in times of great uncertainty, and if we look, say, at Germany in the early 1930s, we have an example of this where even highly educated people, I think 45% of medical doctors joined the Nazi Party. Among the professions, that was the most. Now, these are very highly educated people, and yet, and they are grounded in science. They're grounded in, exploration of ideas, based upon experimentation. And yet, with all of this uncertainty around, I think there's a collapse that people go through where, and I think the same thing, you and I speak openly about Donald Trump. It's interesting that a number of my American friends will not go on record to say anything about Donald Trump because America is so polarized now. That we've got libtards and rhinos and all sorts of nasty terms that are being spilled around. And the same goes the other way. I say nasty things about Donald Trump, and I think they need to be said. Now, you said them very publicly indeed in your brilliant graphic novel, and Rama Trama Trump. which is available free online. Folks, go and look at it. Brilliant illustrations, and it's just such a simple, truthful statement about the cultic aspects, which is what comes out of the need for certainty, the demand that somebody else should know something, the idea that somebody else has figured the secret, and that all you have to do is follow them, and eventually paradise will come upon earth, and the swamp will be fully drained, and happy we shall be.
But the thing is, John, if I could just interject,
you can.
Right now in the United States, there's a great sense of unease. It's not exactly for the same reasons as Germany in the 1930s, but there's a great unease amongst white evangelical Christians about, and this is not my way of putting a group of people down. I have some very, very close today, very dear, close friends who are evangelical Christians, and I love them as my best friends. And there's a kind of anxiety about they're becoming marginalized. I'm not saying they are. I'm just saying there's a perception that it used to be the United States, once the Europeans came and kind of destroyed the cultures that were already here, and then there's a new entity there, so let's call that the United States. There was a very powerful sense that that was a white Christian nation. And yes, the founding fathers did separate church from state, but there's nonetheless a very strong power base amongst the 50 states, what became the 50 states, and that is diminishing. There's a lot of immigrants. Of course, the whole United States is a bunch of immigrants, so it's a bit ironic to say there's immigration going on. Oh my, oh dear. So it's a bit, it seems a bit silly, but there's a real freak out, and it's a sincere freak out. It's not, it's a deep anxiety amongst, the Fox Nation, or the bunch of people who are thinking there's a bunch of people and their skin color and their culture and their language and their values are different, and they're kind of taking over. It's not an imaginary, it's not a fake move. There is, and sure, it's pushed in the media and by Tucker Carlson and so forth. So they press those buttons, and DeSantis and so forth. But it's a real thing, and it happened before Trump. I think Newt Gingrich, he didn't create it; he helped create it. But I think it all sort of started on a large level with him, and there's this deep anxiety, and then that comes in my mind to what you were saying earlier. It's more of a question that I think, or a comment, but the idea of the people who are so certain, or sort of like maybe like a bit like children. It reminds me of the term children of God. We, and I include myself in this. We are children of God. We are not, and I'm thinking of like the Martian Chronicles and science fiction books I've read, like the gods themselves. I forget who wrote that one, but I remember, maybe it was Asimov, but brilliant books I read when I was a kid. And the gods themselves, people are very uncomfortable in hubris. And there's, and particularly when the power structures want to maintain that steep hierarchy, they put the people down and put them further from God. And we are children of God. So I'm just sort of, not harping, but just kind of reflecting on your comment about a lot of these people who are anxious about and need to be certain are sort of like childlike, and they haven't quite grown up. The way you frame that, it may sound to some people a bit pejorative. It might sound like you're making fun or putting people down. And that's certainly, I know it's not your intent, and it's certainly not my intent to do so, but there is a kind of almost a beautiful way to frame what you're saying. And that is, we're children of God and we're supposed to be children. The only problem with that, as I see it, John, that framing, is it makes us as a population incredibly vulnerable to the wolves out there, like Donald Trump, who would take advantage. Donald Trump, forget the Republican, forget the Democrat, forgetting the issues. He is a criminal. He is a criminal. I'm not even talking about the fact that he's a narcissistic sociopath. He's a criminal according to laws. And yet he is able to prey upon people's vulnerability. You set yourself as a child of God. You set yourself as not wanting to grow up in a certain way, and you have several hundred million, actually billions, of people who are highly vulnerable to political cults.
We're all vulnerable to political cults, and and religious cults, which are two forms of social movement. And in hard times, we will, whoever stands up and says, "I know what to do," will tend to be listened to. And there's an expression in Scientology which bothered me from the first time I saw it, which was, I was involved for 9 years, and it was quite early on. And Ron Hubbard said, "Knowledge is certainty." And that, I was just kind of, that can't be true. I think that knowledge is more likely uncertainty, that understanding that we don't understand and learning to live with that. So if we look at the megachurch movement in the US, Jesus said you have to be as a little child to enter the kingdom of heaven. This, suffer the little children to come unto me. And I think that is a reflection not upon intelligence, but upon the innocence of perception, having cleansed the doors of perception, as Aldous Huxley would have it, though I think his method was faulty. Taking mescaline probably won't do it. And I think it's William Blake who first used the expression. And indeed, the band The Doors were first called The Doors of Perception. So that didn't do very well, did it? But so on the one hand, I think we do need a purity of perception, which has the innocence of childhood, and seeing things not through a glass darkly, but directly is important. But also, I focused in the last few weeks on a concept. A long time I've been talking about human predators, and Donald Trump has openly admitted to being a predator. He has said there are predators and there are prey, and you're one or the other, which is not my perception of the world. I think it's a lot more complicated than that. There are animals which are not predators and which are not prey. Elephants, for example, don't tend to, they can be a bit harmful to trees, but they're not really predators, and they're not prey unless you've got an elephant gun, and I haven't. So I think that's a wrong notion. But I was thinking, having read your email to me proposing the topic, that there's a Joni Mitchell line, sometimes change comes out like a broadside accident. There is chaos in the order, random things you can't prevent. And that is the truth about life. Everything's going along nicely. You're eating enough, you're sleeping enough, you're getting some exercise, you're sexually content, all of these things are going along, and then suddenly catastrophe strikes, and it will, because to be human and to be in relationship with other people means that you'll lose people, that friends will occasionally turn on you, that what seemed to be certain will become very uncertain. It's very easy to cling to something that offers certainty. In my life, from the age of 17, that was a notion of enlightenment. And from the age of 17 all the way through Scientology, I had a year of Zen Buddhism before Scientology and loads of Zazen meditation. Then I had 9 years of Scientology, but all through Scientology, my goal was enlightenment. They were talking about superpowers, and becoming a god on earth, and none of them have actually managed to attain that, and I'm very sure of that because I wouldn't be alive if they had. But my interest was, what's the answer to all of this? What on earth is going on? And the further I looked, the more deeply I looked, the less satisfied I was. And that went on for, I don't know, 35 years or something, until one day I went, this is a question I can't answer. I'm not going to become enlightened. I've never met anybody that I consider to be enlightened. And I've met people who are meant to be. And it's a false goal. The goal should be to have the best possible relationships with people and the world. And that's where strength lies, in community, in collaboration, in being pro-social, not in walking away from society, and certainly not in being destructive towards society. And that's led me to this. I'm looking for a word, and maybe somebody watching this can, or maybe Mark, you can give me a better word. But the word I'm looking at that extends the notion of the human predator is the hate monger. The people who pick up beautiful, loving philosophies devised by the Prince of Peace or whoever, and use them to fight war. When the Pope and the Archbishop of Canterbury in the First World War were blessing the guns, and this notion of God being on our side. I mean, talking about the founding fathers, it is worth saying that a number of them were not Christians; they were deists, and so their protection of religion was very personal. Having seen what would happen. And of course, the first New England colonists were Puritans. We're not talking about Christians per se, exactly. We're talking about Christians who've taken a very moral attitude, which says you should not experience pleasure. And I think, I remember reading an account of the way that banqueting became a thing in the US in the late 19th century. And the author said, but because Americans are fundamentally puritanical, and that's not my statement, they eat the food as fast as possible and get indigestion. So they go to a big banquet and they do this themselves. And I think that, that's an interesting observation about us all. So, but some people will involve themselves in good movements. I personally have a very negative view of Mother Teresa. I think she is what is called a saintly narcissist, somebody who puts on a show so that other people will think they're wonderful. I read an article written by a nurse who worked with her for 6 months. I mean, and now there's a big TV thing's been done, which I haven't seen yet, but which I will watch. But this nurse said it was awful. She would go out and find dying people and put them in a bed and convert them to Jesus. And this isn't charitable work. This is, you're not doing this to help the person. And as Jesus said, you should pray in a closet and not make broad your phylacteries, not show off what you're doing if you're going to give something. So I think there are people who, in the history of religion, there are so many of them, people who have commandeered the Christian view of, loving other people as much as you love yourself, and made it a sort of. I was watching something last night, and somebody said, "Well, basically morality is something that those in power create to keep those who have no power subjugated. And so you get all sorts of rules about what you can and can't, or must and mustn't do, and Puritanism, becomes part of that. People start thinking that they start involving themselves in all sorts of activities that are, if you look at the Amish, there's been a kind of breaking down of the Amish in the last couple of decades, because they are going and reading the Bible in English. And it's normally, I think their Bible is in German, I think maybe an old High German, or, and so the rank and file can't read it. It's interpreted for them. And much as, what happened when Zwingli and Luther and Calvin set about, and Tyndale before, putting the Bible into the vernacular, into the language of the people, they went, well, where are the priests? Where are the monks? Now, one of the things that apparently, I'm told, bothered some of the Amish was that there was no directive about which way you wear your suspenders, that whether you cross them at the back or not, which is kind of reminiscent of Lilliput and Blefusco, where Jonathan Swift tells us that the war that's been going on for generations between these two places is about which end you crack your boiled egg, the little enders and the big enders. So you've got whether you cross them or whether you don't. And this infliction of petty rules that comes out, and if you follow this very, very narrow path,
and you're sure about it,
and you blinker yourself to any external influence which is sinful and demonic, then you will eventually drain the swamp. And the problem is generally that the people who are telling us to do these things, when we pull aside the curtains, are people who become, well, they're convicted of child abuse, for example. 500 priests, Catholic priests in Australia, were convicted, with 8,000 victims. And to see how institutions and organizations promote certainty on the one hand, but the people promoting that certainty have another objective.
Yes. So I was just about to ask you, but I'm going to answer it myself. I was about to ask if you can think of any literature where there's someone who pretends publicly to have absolute certainty as a leader, but behind the scenes you find out in the book or the story that indeed they don't. And I was thinking about it because I was just about to ask you about that. And I thought, whoa, I just had this memory. I think I was in college at UC San Diego, where I was an English and American literature major. And I remember reading a story by Michael de Unamuno that had a profound influence on me. And I haven't thought about this in decades. So I don't know if anyone else enjoys our discussions, but I obviously get something out of it.
And how am I spelling this surname? Michael
de Unamuno. And the story is, if I remember properly, it was titled Emmanuel the Good Martyr, like Emmanuel, comma, the Good Martyr. I'm not going to Google it right now because we're having a wonderful, at least for me, discussion. What I recall it's about is there's a beautiful village somewhere in the hills of the Alps, Italy, somewhere, France, something like that. Maybe it was Italy. And in the village, there was a priest who was beloved by all and was the leader, and things were good and then things were bad. And everyone looked to this beautiful, special leader. And there was someone from Chicago came out there, an American, a doubting American, and apparently befriended this leader and sort of dug a little bit beneath the surface. And as I recall, I may not have this exactly correct, but as I recall, the leader, the priest, really didn't believe a whole lot, or let's just say not 100%, or not even 92% in what he was saying. But this leader, who was not on the take or the make, had a very powerful sense that he was upholding the community. He was giving them strength in a very beautiful way. This was not a cult. This was not a cult experience, a destructive cult experience. This was not a destructive cult story.
Mm.
It was an uplifting story. It was a beautiful story.
Mm.
This is a story I read before I went and joined a cult. And it was so amazing. And then I think what happens is the American sort of helps him, or takes over, or takes his position. Maybe he dies or something like that, and passes on the tradition of not really believing it, but acting as such in order to help the community, a feigned sense of certainty, in order to ease the anxiety of the children of God who were uncertain. And I don't know about you, John, but I think I have a slightly different take on it now. But at that time, when I was 15 years old or 17 years old, or maybe I read it in high school, I'm not sure. Maybe it was college. It was beautiful. It was a beautiful exercise in human leadership. Now I view it, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Now I view it as, you're playing with fire, baby.
Yep, absolutely. I agree with that perception of it. And I mean, curiously, there are two political philosophies. There may be more, but there are two that have had a tremendous impact on the world, which are both based in the idea of pretense of knowledge. More recently, we have neoconservatism, and this comes out of Leo Strauss at Chicago University. And Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld were deeply affected by his teaching. In fact, they're deeply affected. What can I say? And his teaching, when you get to it, is so simplistic. There are the guys in the white hats and the guys in the black hats, and he'd like to make comparisons to Westerns, and big fan of John Wayne, probably. And he said that it's important that the people believe. It's important that you maintain their certainty. It doesn't matter whether you do. And this philosophy, when I first encountered this however many years ago, I was immediately reminded of Confucius, something like that, who created a philosophy which has this strand in it too, that what's important is to maintain the rites, to follow the rituals, to keep doing these things, and things will be in harmony. And indeed, I recently saw a documentary about contemporary China, where villagers throughout China are now adopting the Confucian analects as part of their communism. And you know, some of them are very sensible and useful things, but some of them are utterly foolish, you know, from my perspective. And you've got people, you know, seeking to apply these things, and it's sort of a shadow play, you know, that if we all pretend enough, and I mean, there's an aspect of this in cognitive behavioral therapy. Once we all pretend enough, then it will become so. It's a kind of magic. In literature, there are two places that immediately come to mind. One is The Wizard of Oz, that, you know, you've got this little chap on a stool with a megaphone who is shouting out certainty to everybody, and everybody has come to believe him. The other is a story that, again, Ron Hubbard retold, and that really surprised me the first time I saw it, because it seemed to me he was saying something rather dangerous. And it's a story that was written by Lord Dunsany in the 19th century. And in the story, there is a monastery which has been prophesied will survive for 1,000 years. And it's the last day of the 1,000 years. Tausend-Year Reich. And here we are. And a villager walks up, and normally the guards would be there and, you know, check his ID or what have you before he could go in. No guards. And it's a shaggy dog story. It just keeps on going and going. But you go through room after room after room, and eventually he comes to the curtains, the veiled mystery that is at the center of all of this. And this, of course, is taken from Jewish religion and the idea of the Holy of Holies, and which only the high priest can visit. And our intrepid villager gets to the curtains, parts the curtains, and there, in the Holy of Holies, there is absolutely nothing. And for 1,000 years, this has been maintained by selling this idea. You know, we have the Ark of the Covenant, we have some magical doodad that will do something. We have the all-seeing eye, which is on top of the pyramid, and is a very worrying symbol to many people. I don't think it represents the Illuminati personally, but that could just be me. And so there is, and of course, just the whole idea of God, the whole idea of being watched all the time, you know, whether by God or by the lords of karma with their Akashic records, writing everything down, you're being spied on all the time, everything you do. It's actually Alexa and Siri and all of those people that are spying on us. It's not really God. I'm sure God has much better things to do. But nonetheless, that's a child-parent, children of God, if you like, relationship, where you're looking to another intelligence, whether you consider it to be divine or not. You're looking to another intelligence to give you the answers to your problems. And we will never, any of us, become wise with all the knowledge of the world. It's not possible anymore. I think it's said that the philosopher John Locke was the last man to know everything, because we didn't know very much. But now, you know, to be an expert in any single field will require all of your, or most of your brain power. So nobody's going to know everything. And there are always going to be times where we need somebody who is more expert, who has more certainty in the topic than we do, you know, to fix the plumbing or fix us if we're physically in need of surgery. And we give a great deal of faith to these people, and then, you know, when we find the plumbing is not actually working, we change our minds about that particular plumber, but we know that somewhere there will be a plumber who can fix the plumbing, and we seek the great plumber to come and make the faucets work.
Yeah, well, I come back to your reference of this University of Chicago treatise that Don Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, I believe you mentioned, were following. And it sort of makes me wonder about the connection between this absolute certainty. I mean, there's certainty and then there's certainty, and how that is connected, the latter of which is connected to the democratic process, if the two can be said to be compatible. And what I'm seeing today is an application of what Rumsfeld and Cheney maybe, I can't say they pioneered, but they certainly were good at it. And that is this kind of, I actually looked to Newt Gingrich as well for this, but a kind of doubling down. In other words, there's certainty, but then there's a doubling down on certainty, which really makes people feel cared for and everything is fine. And I think we're seeing that as now breaking out into the mainstream political arena in the United States. I mean, it's also been around in monarchies and dictatorships. So it's nothing new. But it's somewhat new. It seems to me, this particular strand of certainty in a democracy. I could be wrong. It's just, maybe let's just say in my lifetime, I haven't seen it yet, or I hadn't recognized it. So you have, for instance, Trump is caught doing something illegal. And he doubles down. He doesn't back away and say, gosh, whoops.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Or even if he didn't say, I'm sorry, he could have just said something that could have covered it up and say, oh, well, my understanding was it was, spinach and not cabbage. But he doesn't do that. He just doubles down on the original crime or misstep or deception or whatever it was. And by doubling down, one of his teachers taught this to him. I forget who that was, but by doubling down, it's a problem in a democracy. And here's why. Because if you have one of the two major political parties of a nation have as their platform this extreme doubling down, such as if we lose, that means the other side was fraudulent.
Yep.
That is no longer by definition a democracy.
No.
And that is precisely we've got dozens of Republicans. And normally I don't use Republican in a pejorative, dark sense. The Republicans in the past, even though I tend to vote Democrat, sometimes Republicans have good things to contribute and sometimes the Democrats do. That's not where we are today.
Abe Lincoln was a Republican.
Right, exactly. So, and sometimes the Republicans are more for fiscal responsibility or whatever. I mean, as I say, I generally tend to be vote Democrat, but it's good to be open to the world. I tend to think of myself these days because I see extremes on the left and the right. There's some crazy stuff going on the left.
Always.
Dangerous, crazy stuff on the right. But so I'm going to hold the center or try to, but I just see that when you go into an election and you publicly state that if I don't win, the other side committed fraud, that is certainty unbound. Whether they believe it or not, I mean, maybe Trump inside of himself is laughing, thinking, these idiots, they listen to everything I say. Or maybe he actually believes it. I don't know if we'll ever be able to know that, which it is, in the same sense that the meditation teacher, cult leader I followed, was he sincerely believing in all his press, or was it a big scam? Beats me.
Yeah, depends from one day to the next, I think. And it certainly
could well be.
That there is a personality type, and I've had direct experience of this more than once, where people cannot be wrong. And if that means changing historical reality, that's what they do. They cannot be wrong. So I've seen people under oath in a court of law lie. And as I watched them, I could see that they didn't know they were lying. They'd seen, and I knew they were lying because I'd been with them when they did the thing that they're being accused of. And I have no doubt. But it really struck me the first time.
Reality check.
The first time that I saw this, and I've seen it a number of times, it really surprised me that somebody could believe their own bull. And let's make a digression on the word bull, by the way. There are people who censor the word bull, thinking that it means bullshit. But in fact, the word bullshit, it appears, was invented by T.S. Eliot. There's a thought. And the original word bull, or bol, the French word, just means nonsense or rubbish. But in English, it became bullshit because, and so now people think it's something that comes out of an animal, but it isn't. It's, it's a perfectly polite word, but people will believe their own bull. And I think probably, certainly looking at Ron Hubbard, he moved between absolutely believing his own bull and absolutely disbelieving it. And there are, many people who are interviewed over the years talk about him saying, it's all nonsense, it doesn't work. His own wife, Mary Sue Hubbard, who loved him enough to go to prison so that he wouldn't have to, she, on a number of occasions, accused him of being a charlatan because Scientology didn't work. It hadn't done what he said it would do. And so I think he did it, that he moved between those positions. That's one type of personality. He was probably a temporal lobe epileptic, as well as quite a variety of other conditions. With Donald Trump, it's interesting because he does use the ad hominem attack the attacker. If somebody says something about me, I will attack them. I will not seek to refute what's been said or rebut what's been said. And that's a nasty habit. So an awful thing. And it should, in interview, you should stop somebody if they do that and say, yeah, but what about the question? But he just pushes on through. He does appear to have tremendous self-belief. But I fear that what I think, mistakenly call the narcissistic personality disorder is a state where people don't have any self-belief at all. That their self-belief comes from persuading other people that they are right, other people that they are good, that they are true, that they are knowledgeable. It's not in being any of those things. It's in conning people into believing that so that they can believe that it's true for themselves. They can believe that they are contributing something incredible to humanity, where in fact all they're doing is creating confusion.
Speaking of that confusion, there was a time many years ago when I was in the inner circle of a meditation group gone destructive, where I was able to gain some insight into what we're talking about, pulling back the curtain to see, the Wizard of Oz, just spew, and the way that happened was because I got to observe for many hours this person, Dr. Frederick Lenz Rama. Newsweek called him the yuppie guru. I observed him coming off a bad acid trip. So I got to observe his psyche. And this is described, this is not a commercial statement. All the stuff I'm about to mention is free. But my first book, Take Me for a Ride, Coming of Age in a Destructive Cult, there's a chapter about what I'm about to say. And this movie I'm making based on that book, and Rama Trauma Trump, also has this as one of the very important scenes. It may be the most important scene in the whole film because it provides real deep insight into how someone like this thinks. And essentially what happened was this person, Fred Lenz, Rama, he called himself, was having a bad acid trip. And he called me into the room. I was the only one there. And I helped him through the acid trip because he was just having a real rough time of it. And I was like, I'd point out, I knew he liked birds. He was really into birds. And so he was freaking out. And I said, hey, Rama, look, it's a beautiful blue bird. And I'd be pointing to something that I knew wasn't there. And he's like, wow, it's beautiful. Wow. And it really helped him. So, and then he fell asleep. And then he woke up and I was there next to him. And he looked at me and he said, Mark, we used to be friends. Is that right? And I said, yes, Rama, because we're now at the stage several years into my disciplehood where he became quite destructive and we were not friends. And he said, would you like to be my friend? And I'm holding back the tears at this point because, my life had become very difficult, as did hundreds of other people in the group. And he's like, it was accessing a different part of his psyche because he was tripping on acid.
Mm.
And he was very sweet and like, what happened? He said, Mark, what happened? We used to be friends. Something happened. And he said, all right, we're going to be friends. And he fell back asleep. And then he woke up again. And he said, he looked around the room. He said, are you on the net? And I said, the what? And he said, the net, the net, the network, the psychic net energy network. And I didn't know what to say, but I'm trying to like, I was like, okay, I'm going to be this guy's friend. Great. So I said, sure. I don't know what the heck he's talking about. And then he calls someone else in the room. Are you on the net? And he's like calling people up. Are you on the net? And like, he's defining a hierarchy. Are you in this group? Are you in this group? And then he fell back asleep. And then he woke up again, maybe like an hour later or whatever. And he looked at me and it's like, what are you doing here? And I was like, I'm helping, I'm like, and he's like, you're stealing my power. Yeah, you want to be my friend. Right. Sure. I know all about you.
Mm.
And it got sinister and back to where we were before this acid trip. So anyway, that's just a quick little story that, as I say, I describe in my book and this film that I'm working on, where I want to provide this, this story because there's so many students who never saw that part of him.
Mm.
And to me, it helped me to leave him because it gave me insight into the layers of his confused personality.
Mm.
So earlier, he was maybe not so certain. But when he came off that acid trip, he became in each layer of his, like layers of an onion, of his consciousness became more and more certain and more destructive. And there's a real lesson there. It was like Psych 101 in grad school. I mean, it was just incredible to see that.
It is so often the case that people assume an identity to project publicly. I have a friend who's an acupuncturist, and I actually had come to not have very little faith in acupuncture from previous experiences. It was like, yeah, okay, fine. But then my son, one of my boys, had a chronic headache, and nothing would shift it. And a dear friend who was also training in acupuncture at this time, said, oh, you happen to live close to this guy who's this absolutely brilliant acupuncturist. So we went to him and he was able to switch off this headache, which is amazing. He could just switch it off. But he could only switch it off for about 24 hours, and he could only do it once every 2 weeks. That's what he reckoned. But every 2 weeks, we'd go back and he'd switch it off, and my son would have a little bit of relief. So I started seeing him myself, and I saw him, I don't know, for a year or two. And he had just the most incredible calming presence. I always came away feeling better. And I'd figured that it wasn't probably much to do with the needles. It was just to do with this really remarkable presence this man had. And so we'd known each other for a year or two. And he offered to give me a lift home one day. We got into the car, and I was in the car with a completely different man. It was really shocking to me, having known him for such a long time. He was this really calm, loving, sweet man who could make people relax, feel better. He'd got the most incredible bedside manner, for somebody in the healing trade. And I already knew that that's a large part of how we feel better. If a doctor is horrible to us, then we will, not feel. So he had this wonderful manner. But I discovered that he actually had a life filled with anxieties. And that was what took him up the rest of the time. And seeing this movement between the professional identity and the person who's still an absolutely lovely man, but not actually in the miracle worker class. Looking at so many cult leaders, Rajneesh is a wonderful example. because even Marianne Sheila, in her very interesting autobiography, where she is still, she went to prison, I think, for 8 years for the mass poisonings at in Oregon, and all sorts of things, all sorts of horrible things they were doing. And she says in her book, well, I only did these things because he told me to. She was 16 when her father gave her to Rajneesh, and you could get the wrong impression of her quite easily. I became quite fascinated with her because she took the blame. The reality was that Rajneesh, according to Hugh Milne, his bodyguard in The God That Failed, and according to Marianne Sheila, who still is saying, he was the greatest ever. Where's a book gone? I've got it here somewhere. Yeah, the book is called Don't Kill Him. So I think he was already dead by then, but so that didn't work. But she agrees with Hugh Milne. Hugh Milne says, well, here's the secret. And I read this sort of 300-page book, and at the very end, this is The God That Failed. He says, and he was taking 50 milligrams of Valium, diazepam, every day, and 2 one-hour sessions of nitrous oxide. And then when you look at film of Rajneesh, and he's claiming publicly to have he's now silent. He's not going to say anything. Privately, with Marianne Sheila and the close retinue, he's telling them what to do. But publicly, he's just going. And as you look at him again, he's stoned out of his crate. Yeah. And this is the way of projecting certainty, appearing to be floating on cloud 9, because the guy's tripping all the time. He's just, and 50 milligrams, I think Marianne Sheila must have it wrong, because I think she says he was taking 340 milligrams a day. And I think that would probably kill an elephant. But 50 milligrams is still, it's prescribed in 2 and 5 milligram lots. So 50 milligrams a day. The effect on the central nervous system is quite overwhelming. But this is a way of projecting certainty in public. And then in private, you have the reality. And so, it's a good idea probably to poke your guru occasionally to see if they're really there.
Which takes us back to The Wizard of Oz, which may be one of the greatest stories ever told for a very vulnerable population. But of course, humans being who we are probably see The Wizard of Oz not in that light. And
your group's a cult, mine's not. The guy leading your group is a charlatan, mine's not.
Right.
I'm too smart to be taken in by anything like that.
Right. And I learned that from my cult leader.
Yeah, that's it. He told me.
Right. Which takes us maybe just to wrap it up, the whole concept of, okay, with that knowledge, what can you do with that in society? And the answer might be not much.
I think we can show people that there is such a thing as science, and that science is not a belief system, it's a method. It's an attitude of mind, which some people would call skepticism. I would probably call it skepticism. Now, differentiate that. There is cynicism, which is taking a negative view of everything. And we all feel like that sometimes. And there is skepticism, which means asking questions, checking it out. And I do know that that's not to the dictionary definition necessarily, but this is what I'm looking at, that if somebody won't let you ask questions, they don't know what they're talking about. And I'll give a very specific example of this. I was at a lecture and a professor stood up, and this was 30 years ago. The professor stood up on the stage and he said, well, it's good that Scientology no longer harasses people. So I stood up and said, yes, it does. And he said, I don't have enough time to answer questions. I've got a flight to catch.
But that wasn't a question.
No, it was a statement of reality. And I not being willing to sit down, because that's the kind of person I am, I sort of said, well, I've been harassed within the last 2 days. So I know that what you're saying is not true. And he got very huffy and carried on with reading out his talk. When the next guy came on, it was a forensic psychologist, a police psychologist called Brian Tully, who I was incredibly impressed by. I'd heard about him and had him invited to this meeting. And he started out and he said, well, the problem is one of authority. And so if anybody has anything they'd like to interject, any questions they'd like to ask, just because I'm on the stage doesn't mean I'm in charge. And that attitude is the attitude. And going with Socrates and Lao Tzu, people who know they know everything don't know anything.
Right. And if you have absolute certainty, or if someone has it, then learning stops. When you have uncertainty, you can ask those questions, which lead, as you know, to other questions. And that's the journey of learning and evolving your thoughts based on the world around us. So in a sense, uncertainty is the way of the scholar and the curious adventure traveler. And for those who sort of want to, they've done their homework, they've gone to high school or whatever, and now we're done. Well, that's another path that you can take. You can stop thinking and bottle it up and have all the knowledge of the universe constipated behind a wall of bull.
Exactly. Absolutely. And exactly. And yeah, so the other thing is how fervent people become, how passionate people become about their ideas. And Robert Thulas in Straight and Crooked Thinking, which is the origin of critical thinking, and I would say still the primary text. I've never read anything that comes close. His grandson revised the book. But he says, as soon as you start to feel passion coming up, you're not being rational. You have to back away when you start going, oh, I know this is the truth. You know, seeing in America at the moment, people on, you know, I'm not sure it's left and right. I'm not sure what it is personally. I don't really believe in left and right. I think this is a three-dimensional problem. It's not a linear problem that you've got the left at one end and the right at the other and stuff in between. It's three-dimensional. It's massively three-dimensional. But when I see people who represent themselves as members of Antifa, for example, and I know that there's so much going on now about, you know, Black Lives Matter is a slogan, it's not a movement, for example. So when a bunch of people get together with placards and say, we're Black Lives Matter, they're not. I'm not sure what to call them if that's not what's happening. But seeing, you know, in situations where people are declaring that we should have equal rights, I am absolutely for that. I'm absolutely for that. We live in a corrupt, imbalanced world where a small number of people have far too much power and influence. I don't believe that they sit together as conspirators in the Illuminati. I think they're all fighting with each other to maintain their power. But nonetheless, when I see people who represent themselves as Proud Boys or Oath Keepers or the KKK or what have you on one side, and people who represent themselves as, you know, representing democracy and liberty on the other, and what I'm seeing is a line of people with megaphones standing 2 yards apart going, F you, F you, F you. I know that dialogue has broken down and I know that we're not going to get anywhere. So part of certainty is the willing to dispense of the existence of others, to use Robert Lifton's point from his last and final of the 8 deadly sins of thought reform, where you no longer care about other people's well-being. You know, they're non-people now because they believe this other thing. Because, you know, if you don't believe what I believe, then you're just wrong. And that can actually move towards not only having a disdain for them or not caring about their welfare, it can move to harming them. And it can lead to genocide. So the attitude that we have, if we hate people, if we want revenge on people, then the world is going to turn sour. Things are going to go wrong. And I'm certain about that.
I thank you. You just stole my line. Very good. Very. Oh, that was going to be my finale.
Oh,
I don't know what to
darn.
say now. I don't know what to say. I'm uncertain. So thank you for that discussion, John. That was
Thank you.
enlightening, and I think it sort of underpins a lot of the bizarre things happening in the world today.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And it's always a pleasure. And it's always, for me, I will come away from all of our conversations with thoughts having been provoked. And isn't that just the best thing? Isn't that just a wonderful thing?
I'm sure of it.
Because we have not achieved absolute certainty. I'm sure we will in the next few minutes, but as yet we have not achieved absolute certainty, which means we can still have conversations, we can still breathe, you know, we can still laugh and things like that. We don't have to just like that, because that's not good for us. So been a pleasure and a delight as ever, Mark. Thank you so much.
Okay.
And thank you for watching, and do all the things you know you're meant to do. Mostly get onto Patreon because we're trying to bring Spike out of poverty, and your donations are deeply appreciated. And there we go. Enough promotion. And go out and read Mark's free books. What is wrong with you giving things away? What kind of capitalism is that? They're great. Go and get Ramatrama Trump and take me for a ride. There's another one, isn't there? You got 3 out there. Yeah.
I've got a book called The Monkey Bible.
Yeah. Read these things. They will be good for you. Grand. Thanks again. Cheer, bye. Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much. He's stoned out of his crate.